coming online to be listening to this live, and to those who are watching it later, a warm welcome. And in the magic of Zoom and time being non-linear, we are all gathered together at the same place in time in our Earth Exchange Café. So I invite you to open the door and step inside this beautiful space where our favorite tea or coffee or hot chocolate is there waiting for us. And we take our seats at our favorite chair, surrounded by the books written by those who have radical joy practices and philosophies, articles, music playing on the record player, batiks and fabrics and art all adorning the walls and the floors, and music from singers who have sung about how to find beauty in wounded places. And as we sit here, we just settle on in and just feel the camaraderie around us. Once again, we welcome the possibility of a beautiful, expansive, imaginative, and joyous, we hope, conversation that will be unfolding between Francis Weller and Trebi and I in the next hour. And so I warmly welcome you all as participants, and I warmly welcome you, Francis.
Thank you. Thank you, Harry.
Thank you, Harry. That was beautiful. I like this cafe a lot that you've painted a picture of. So I forgot to write down a bio for Francis today. So we decided that I would just kind of wing it. Francis is probably very well known to many of you who are listening, Francis Weller, because he's done work with ceremonial gatherings all over the world to bring people into touch with the grief that we feel for so many different kinds of reasons, and that it's sometimes so hard to tap into and let go of and move through to a different place. Francis has written 2 books and co-authored 1 book. The best known of them is The Wild Edge of Sorrow, which has been published in many different places and read by many people. And I met Francis a few years ago, and we have done a conversation together online that our publisher launched. And I know several people who have done trainings with him. His work has really made a huge difference in the way people think about grief, and more importantly, how they respond to their own grief and how they tap into it with less fear and denial. So Francis, thank you so much for being with us.
It's a great pleasure to be here with the 2 of you. I like going to cafes, so this fits perfect with my morning. So
good.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. So I'd like to start. I've noticed, particularly in recent years, that when people cry and they're with somebody else, they will almost always apologize. What do you think that's about? Where does that come from?
There's a very strong ethic around control, particularly among white Western people, that you always have to be in control. This model of constraint and containment of your own emotional process. It's like we have a very narrow band of emotions that we're allowed to occupy. I think I talked about that in the book about the flatline culture we live in. So the range of what we're allowed to occupy is so narrow that when we drop out of that, like we're pulled into the depths of grief, we feel afraid, partly because we're all alone with it. We've failed the mission, which is to stay in control of it. And now we feel fully exposed and almost ashamed of what it is that we've let become visible. So we try to, take our steps back and get back in control as fast as we can. This happens at funerals. It happens every place where there's this sense of, I'm so sorry I lost control. I'm so sorry I couldn't, control myself. But that's what that's what soul requires, is periodic times of losing control, of falling out of control, and letting what's within us be held by others. Otherwise, we're in a constant state of having to monitor and control the interior world so that it doesn't get exposed to the exterior world.
Yeah, you're a big advocate of communal grieving. That's what your practices are all about. That you don't, that, you know, it's okay to cry in private, of course. It's a good thing to cry in
Right.
private, but we need to cry and grieve publicly. Why is that? What makes the difference?
Well, if you think about our long evolutionary story, grief has always been communal. It's never been a private thing until very recently. The healing modality. I remember being in a continuing education class with Rick Hansen, which I'm sure many of your listeners know Rick Hansen and his wonderful work in neuropsychology. He wrote The Buddha's Brain and resilience, and he was talking about all these interior practices to help us process traumatic events, to process our difficult emotions. And I thought these are wonderful tools. But the original context was communal. If you look around the planet and you look at healing ritual, healing practices, and grief practices, they're not individualized. The healing context is community. So, you know, in my work with people, I'll often say to them, this is a good place to begin to tolerate contact in this very vulnerable place. You know, to know one-to-one that we can touch this place and you're not going to die. You're not going to fall, you know, and forever into the depths of hell. But I say, but at some point you're going to need a larger holding vessel for this grief. This isn't large enough. The psyche is waiting for that deep witnessing that comes when you're weeping side by side, being welcomed back into the arms of the village. I have seen this hundreds, thousands of times. The look on people's faces after the rituals are over is like almost a sense of deep relief that the signal frequency was finally given for my psyche to recognize this is what I've been waiting for. And people will often say at the end of the ritual, you know, I've never done anything like that in my life, but it felt oddly familiar. So there's something in us that is deeply shaped to expect this kind of experience. That's why when I wrote the Wild Edge of Sorrow about the 5 gates of grief, this 4th gate is what we expected and did not receive. We expected to be grieving in community. We expected to be saying thank you in community. We expected to do heal in community, and almost none of that's materialized. And what we're left with is this profound feeling of emptiness. And then strategizing a way to cope with that emptiness by, you know, all manners of things, whether it's anesthesia or busyness or, you know, secondary satisfactions like wealth or privilege or power. But what we really crave is some space that welcomes all of who we are. That's what we anticipated. That's what we need.
You mentioned the 5 gates of grief that you've identified, and I think that's really important because it's not only about the loss of people.
Right.
So would you describe what those 5 gates are for us?
Yeah, the first gate, as you mentioned, is that everything we love, we will lose. That's the first truth of grief, is that you get to hold on to nothing. Everything you love, including your own body, your own life, will pass. And so that's it's a fierce truth, but it's one that we all have to wrestle with. The second gate has to do with the places that have not known love. So we are all conditioned by families and by education and by religion and every facet of society about what is approvable and what is not. And you learn pretty quickly, like I learned in my family, you couldn't show anger, you couldn't show sadness, you couldn't show exuberance, you couldn't show, you know, sensitivity. So those things all begin to marginalize themselves. We push them to what I call outcast status. And so every loss to my integrity, to my wholeness, should be something that we grieve over. But because of the conditions of what we push away, we typically also judge and we hate. You can't grieve what you hate. So that's the majority of work in therapy, is beginning to repair the relationships to the outcast parts of our life. once we do that, the first thing you notice is all the sorrow that's there. The third gate is the sorrows of the world. And this one is impinging upon us every day now. When I first started doing grief rituals, maybe 2 or 3 of the people there would say, I'm here because of what's happening to our world. Now it's well over half of them. They're there because the grief of the world is just so heavy on their hearts and souls, and very few places to take it. So, third gate. Fourth gate, as I mentioned, is what we expected and did not receive. And this is the deep wiring within us for communal life. We expected to share meals together, to wake up and offer our dreams to others. We expected to gather food and to do the rituals. We expected rounds of initiation to bring us into a sacred sense of adulthood. We expected all these elements, and almost none of that is materialized. And like I said, what takes that place then is this profound sense of emptiness. And grief is one of the ways that we begin to water that emptiness with our tears and begin to recognize how much has been missing in our life, not because of personal failure, but because of cultural amnesia. We have forgotten what we need as a collective to make and shape real human beings. And the fifth gate is what I call ancestral grief. And the ancestral grief, the more I sit with people, the more I realize that almost all grief is ancestral.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, the shame I've been grieving over my lifetime didn't begin with me. It began generations ago. I'm the current curator of that. And it's my job to work with that, but I'm not the originator of that shame. It began generations ago. And so much of what we're grieving, what we're dealing with, whether it's racially, economically, socially, environmentally, these had antecedents. Is that the right word? Is that the one that comes before? I think. Okay. So, yeah.
Precedents. Maybe it's precedents.
Precedents. So this began, as Rumi would say, in some other tavern. This began a long time ago. A lot of our ecological and sociological issues began 2,000 years ago, at least, when colonization began in the European countries by Rome and then by the church, and all of the dislocation of purpose, place, myth, story, ritual, language, all of those things got displaced. And so we are dealing with the consequences of that ancestral grief in our very bones today. And then others have added other gates to that, the gates of harms that we have caused to others. It's sometimes called the sixth gate of grief. But that gives you a feeling for, and I didn't make this up, I just began noticing this in the grief circles, that they weren't coming just because, a child died or a marriage ended or they, lost a beloved animal friend. No, all these other places where grief has just kind of cloistered itself because it's not been publicly acknowledged. We don't acknowledge those other 4 gates or 5 gates. We just acknowledge that first gate of grief. But we're carrying this around constantly. And we need places to set it down and to keep the heart from getting so saturated that we end up living this life of constant oppression, like sediment on our souls.
I thought it was interesting. A few minutes ago, you spoke about telling people when they begin to come to your practices, that they can tolerate a new relationship with their grief. And
Right.
it's a great word. You're kind of letting them in to the experience gently rather than saying, you're going to love this. You can tolerate this, which is just an indication of how remote from it we already are, that has to be the way you get into it, by tolerating it.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's so much fear and anxiety around grief. We don't trust it. It's an unwelcome guest. When it comes, it feels like we're going to be in free fall forever. So we have this very wary relationship to it. And so all I'm trying to do, and I think one of the images I wrote about was also that frequently grief doesn't feel like it has a bottom to it.
Yeah.
So when you get near it, it feels like you're going to be just falling off the edge forever. So in my practice, my job was to try to slowly put some kind of holding space underneath the grief. And once they could tolerate and recognize that grief does not want to take me hostage, it actually wants to bring me back into aliveness. See, that's part of the fear is our fantasies, our fictions about grief is it's a place of deadness. And anybody who's really opened up to grief, it is not a dead space at all. It's not comfortable. It's not, cozy and warm. It is difficult. It's a fierce guest, but it is radically alive. You feel everything when that energy takes its place in your being. And our job is to be alive, not happy. Our job is to really be alive. And grief is one of those places, if you push it away, just another stories keep popping in my mind, but one of them,
everyone loves stories.
I remember sharing this when I was in West Africa visiting my friend's village. I remember commenting to a woman there, says, "You have so much joy." Because she was just so ebullient. And she said, "Well, that's because I cry a lot." And we don't make that association at all. We think if you cry, you're going to be depressed. You're going to be sad. You're going to be, but there's a corresponding, if we break that flat line, we have to drop into the deeper register of grief. That opens the upper register of joy. We really don't have a lot of joy in this culture. We have substituted excitement and stimulation for genuine joy. We try to, adrenalize ourselves so that we have a pulse, that we feel alive. But the moment you begin to close the door on sorrow, you begin to close the door on aliveness, and so we're kind of in a bind. We're told to do this all by ourselves, and we can't. So consequently, we have to somehow shut it down, close it down. And the outcome of that is a lot of, half-dead people walking around. There's a wonderful line from South Africa, when death finds you, make sure it finds you alive. And most of us are backing our way into the grave, just not really taking up the challenge of being fully alive. And I understand why. I have tremendous compassion for that situation, that so few of us have communal settings to take what needs to be taken to those holding spaces, and the weight of it becomes crushing.
So I'm curious what you were like as a kid? I'm always fascinated with how several of the memories that we bring forth into our adult lives of our childhoods, they are often really, really important, consequential memories because they're indications of who we became, what we loved, what we believed in, what bothered us. So do you have a story about your childhood that you might go back to in your mind every now and then and say, yes, this was me. This was who I became?
It's a very interesting question, because my reality was that I remember almost nothing from my childhood. One memory I'd had, as you spoke about that, was as I was growing up, every night when I would crawl into bed, my prayer was, "Please God, let my parents live till I'm at least 20. Because my mom was 46 when I was born, my dad was 48. So they were old. I mean, they were as old as my friends' grandparents. And I knew the fragility of this situation, even just as a young boy, and just praying. And my dad made it till I was 22. He had a massive stroke when I was 16. And that radically altered my life. I was no longer just a young teenage boy. Everyone else was gone. I was the youngest of 8 kids. Everyone was gone. So suddenly I was taking care of my dad. I was dressing him, feeding him, helping out with the shoe store that we had. It's like there wasn't that space to really allow myself to be young and to just enjoy my world. So there was a lot of that sense of the impending feeling of loss, anticipatory grief. was always there for me. I was always anxiously waiting for that next death, the next grief to come into my world. So if that's any indication, that, yeah, that certainly was saturating my world very early on, definitely.
Yeah, and even having like a timeline for how long you wanted your parents to live.
Yeah.
It wasn't like let them be old. It was just 20 years. That's all I'm asking for.
That's all I'm asking. And we almost made it. So, yeah.
All right, I want to pause and see if you have something to ask, Frances.
Well, thank you to people who are commenting. We've got a few people on Facebook that are watching, and Marianella asks an interesting question, which I might expand and ask a sort of additional question onto it, which is, she says, dislocation is the word of the day. Everything from war to ecocides keep pushing us into despair. How can we make the world see that we are mass producing grief? And I wonder, with that, thinking about that, can you expand a little bit about what maybe is a paradox, that our cultural sensationalism is making us feel this strong sort of adrenalized grief, while at the same time we are kind of dumbing down and numbing the grief processes? So can you expand a little bit about that and maybe help us to see what's going on really on a cultural level?
Well, one of the ways I've begun to imagine it is that we've entered the long dark, that we've entered a period of radical descent as a species. This is not a time of rising. It's not a time of confidence. It's not a time of ease. It's a time of descent. We are going down. And in the ways of understanding that, we're entering the territory of soul. Soul is that territory of descent into the darkness, into the underworld, into the shadowed territories where vulnerability, loss, tenderness, trauma, all of these difficult pieces of our life are encountered. What I like about the imagery of the long dark is that it's also a gestational place. We're taken into a place where it's not about figuring it out. We're not going to figure it. We've got all the information we need. So it isn't about lack of data or information. It's really a lack of our capacity to hold and get silent enough to listen. This is a profound time of humility. We don't know what's going on. It's all falling apart by necessity. All of those dislocations and racisms and, economic injustices and all of these things have to collapse. Our job is to cooperate in the collapse and to get quiet enough to hear the possible intimations of what living culture might come out of the ashes. There's a wonderful phrase in the Inuit tradition called kartsaluni. And kartsaluni means sitting quietly together in the dark, waiting expectantly for something creative to occur. That, I think, is our primary instruction manual for right now, is we have to sit quietly together in this darkness and wait patiently for something creative to occur. That's our work. We know almost nothing about it. We're such a light-sided culture. And particularly, again, white Western culture is so fixated on light and rising and ascension. We are very unfamiliar with this process of descent, of going down into the underworld. But that's where we are. I don't think there's much doubt about that. I just wrote the preface for a book by Dwayne Elgin called Choosing Earth. And in it, I lay out some of the dynamics of the long dark and the fact that the keynote for the coming generations is going to be grief. The long dark means it's not going to be resolved by the next fiscal quarter or the next, election cycle or the next decade. Dwayne lays out the next 5 decades and probabilities of what could happen depending on what we do over these decades. And it's not pretty. Whether it's ecological, species depletion, whether it's economic injustices or the ecological need for migration and movement because of inhospitable environments. We have to become skillful in grief at this point. That's really what is on the table. Take up this apprenticeship with sorrow. That's our sole job right now. I have no idea if I answered the question or not, but.
Well, no, what I hear from that is perhaps, you know, it's the third gate, isn't it? The sorrows of the world. And rather than the cultural question of how did we get here, who's manipulating this kind of mass-produced grief, it's more, what do we do with it? If we've got it, what do we do with it? And where does it lead us?
So I think there's almost a necessity in this time. You know, in the old alchemical traditions, they would talk about this as the nigredo, as the blackening. It's in that, and all soul work begins in the nigredo. It begins in the blackening. And they called it the subtle dissolver. Now, things aren't so subtle right now, but things are dissolving. Things are breaking apart. They're breaking down. And certain things can only happen in the darkness. And so this is a necessary time, as uncomfortable as it is, as scary as it is, as grief-filled as it is. This is a necessary time. Now, most likely, the three of us won't see the farther shore of this long dark. I'm not going to see 2 generations from now, you know. But my job is to plant as many seeds as possible of what could germinate into living culture, to remember the old fabric of building community around ritual, around singing, around poetry, around story, you know, around shared practices. Those are the things that helped sustain community for tens, hundreds of thousands of years. And it's not about advances, it's about remembering at this point. Carl Jung talked about the unforgotten wisdom at the core of the psyche. So there's an unforgotten wisdom, so that when we're near the frequency of ritual or singing together or sharing meals or being in a cafe, some part of us recognizes the rightness of that frequency. And that's what we have to do now, I think, is begin to recall and remember those original shapes that gave rise to living culture. We don't have a living culture here. We have a disparate society, but nothing cohesive about it. Nothing that binds us together. And that's what I love doing in our weekend gatherings and our long trainings.
What stands out also about what you're saying is that the goal is not to run in and fix it. You know, that's another thing. If we do in this culture, if there's something that is awry, you have to go and fix it. So like with Radical Joy for Hard Times, our goal when we go to places that are damaged or under threat is not to dash in and fix it. You know, you're not cleaning it up. You're not protesting, you know, or whatever. You're just being there. And it's what you're saying about the grief. You know, that it's not, and it's what you do in your practices. It's not come and do this and grieve and you'll be fixed.
Yeah. The American attitude, well, I did the workshop, so I should be fine, you know. And we often say at the end of the ritual that, you know, we didn't do this just for ourselves. We did this so our heart could become less occupied by grief and that our love might fall into the streets more. It might fall into the watershed.
Into the streets more. That's beautiful.
Yeah, it might fall into the watershed more. You know, just as Wendell Berry said, it all turns on affection. And when the heart is closed, that affection is stymied. It is silenced. And so we really want to soften and warm this space. That was another one of those alchemical ideas that we have to keep the material warm. And we have a pretty cold relationship with grief. And so grief that's not kept warm hardens, it congeals, it gets congested in the heart. And then again, we lose that person. We lose our ability to love this world. And that's what we need right now.
Sorry to interrupt. Karen Wolenchek asks a really wonderful question.
Hello, Karen.
What has deepened or widened for you since writing The Wild Edge of Sorrow? And if you were writing it from scratch now, what would you include and add, and perhaps what would you amend or take away?
That is a good question.
Well, it feels like what happened as a consequence of sitting in circles of grief for 25 years now or longer is that it feels like something in the depths of me has broadened out. So in some ways I can hold more. I can be present for more of what is coming. I think in my earlier incarnation, being very alone and private, my capacity was very limited. And so it feels like my capacity has broadened and deepened to be present for what is really unfolding in the world right now. Again, I think it's added to my sense of, I almost said courage. That's not a bad word. Just my ability to stay present to what is unfolding in front of me. It's hard. It's really hard. It's also given me a sense of what are the requirements to stay alive and open. So writing the book and everything I've written subsequent to that, the essays and such, have all been about trying to articulate what living culture might look like and how a living culture would respond to these times. You know, that we would have grief rituals every month or every other week in every town. You know, I've shared that when we do our grief rituals, we have people coming from Australia and England and, you know, all over the country and Canada. And it's like, this is wonderful. So glad you're here. But this is a symptom of our amnesia. This should be happening everywhere. This is at the heart of our grief, is how much we have forgotten how to be human beings together. That you have to travel, what, 8,000 miles for the privilege of crying next to another human being without self-consciousness? That's our sickness right there. That's our grief right there. So that's what, you know, writing this and working with this for many, many, many years, it's more like a, you know, a recalibration and a recall of, oh, that's what shaped us. That's what allowed us to survive as a species. Oh, this is what we need in order to be true human beings. And so that's a lot of what, I don't know what more I'd say about that, but good question, Carol. Good to hear from you.
I know that your gatherings last for a few days, you know, so people go from that place of you can tolerate this to being full participants in it. And I attended the Parliament of the World's Religions in Chicago last year, and Matthew Fox, the theologian, does a ceremony called the Earth Mass.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with it?
Yeah, I've done that with Matthew.
Oh, you have?
Yeah.
So part of it entails getting down on what he calls all sevens. So your knees, your hands, your forehead, and just expressing grief. And then he says there will come a time when you're going to start hearing the voices of everybody else. And the one that I did in Chicago, I think there were estimated to be 300 or 400 people. And what did happen was eventually you started hearing the voices of others, and without it trying to happen, the moans and the sobs turned into intonations of like ah and oh, and it was pretty extraordinary. And it happened in such a short time. So I mean, I just mention it because there is that eagerness for something to happen, whether it's going to happen in just a few minutes or whether it's going to happen over a period of days.
Yeah, I think we're mainly waiting for permission. I think we're just eager for some spaces to be held that say, this is allowed. This is permitted, it's encouraged, it's welcome. I mean, one of the parts I love about our ritual is that when you return, you can go down to the grief shrine as many times as you want. And every time you come back, you're thanked. You're welcomed back. You're embraced if you want the embrace. If you don't, you just bow. But You're embraced by many, many others in the village, and thank you for doing that. You did that for all of us. So one of the things we have to overcome is this sense of private grief. Like, this is mine. I think part of what you're talking about, Trebi, in that ritual that Matthew led, is that you begin to reverberate to the idea that this is communal grief. These are our sorrows. It's like, I might not have your particular grief. I might not have had a partner die by suicide, or a child who died, or, I may not have that, but I can resonate with the field that you're in. And this is our grief. This is what we are being asked to carry. And getting it out of privatization, which is a big disease of Western ideology, and individualism, another disease of Western ideology, and coming back into the communal field. Wow, there's such relief. There's such a feeling of spaciousness again around it, that this is welcomed. So I love your story, Trebi. That's what I see every time people arrive on Friday night as strangers. It's very quiet in the room. You might say hello to the person sitting next to you, but by Sunday afternoon, we are a village.
Mm.
And not because we know each other's narrative story, but we know each other's soul story being expressed through ritual process. There's a kind of transparency that comes in that space where I can say, I know you. I know you. I've seen the way you are with the sacred. I've seen the way you are with soul. I've seen the way you are with sorrow. Those things tell me I can be in relationship to you,
Beautiful. So I'm curious, what happened with your grief? What happened to grief in general, I guess, is what I really want to know. Do you think during COVID, because our already limited ways of being together in grief were suddenly removed? You couldn't have funerals, although people came up with some very creative ways to do so. So did you notice anything particular, like during that time and then after, how people's relationship with grief as a whole might have changed?
Well, I think it was another element in the breakdown of denial. When I began giving book readings many years ago, very few people came initially, and then it began to grow, not because of me, because I was still pretty unknown, but the topic was beginning to percolate into psyches around the country. And to the point now where the denial factor is really cracking. And I think COVID was another one of those piercing events that say, I'm not immune. I will know loss. I will know illness. I'll know death. My friends might die. My family members might die. That's why in my collection of essays, it's called In the Absence of the Ordinary. The ordinary kind of stopped at that point. And I think it did a positive thing in the sense that it helped further create the fissure in our denial of the condition of the world. It was like I oftentimes call COVID the kind of like the warm-up band. It's getting us ready for larger levels of loss and trouble.
Wow.
Yeah.
That speaks to me a little bit about something that I was considering about what you were saying about disenfranchised grief, which, although you mentioned that it was about what we expected and didn't receive because the community is simply not prepared for it culturally. We're just alone in our feelings, and it sort of maybe ties in with a few of the questions that are coming up that Rachel Hawthorne has asked. How do we not take on the pains and sorrows of other people and be left with all of that on our shoulders? And I think what you mentioned about entering into the communal sphere and allowing that space to sort of hold you rather than you hold the grief, I think that's very powerful. Yeah. And then Jonathan asks, how do we create places for grief practice, spontaneously or planned? And it seems to feed into that question of what's COVID taught us culturally. What are we beginning to understand that we need to begin to put into place and make more overt?
I feel that we need to really start very small. build our faith in grief, build our confidence that we are able to hold one another in grief. So maybe having 4 or 5 people over to your house and just say, tonight, our topic is loss.
Wow.
And let's just make an agreement. We're not here to fix each other. We're not here to give advice. Grief isn't a problem to be solved. It's a presence awaiting witnessing. And so we need to begin to, maybe we'll say a poem or a prayer or light a candle, and then we'll share our stories and just make space for that. So, you begin to build spaces that over time you increase the levels of heat. So gathering 4 or 5 people in your home will be a warm evening. And that's really important, to build some warmth into this space that's been pretty cold and isolated. And over time, you begin to maybe think about, well, what can we do now to increase the heat? Well, I make quite a few suggestions in the back of the book. You can do the stone ritual where we gather around a bowl of water and we speak our grief aloud into the stone and put it in the water, and you begin to see that, oh, this is our communal grief. This isn't just mine. This is all of our grief held together. So you slowly build, again, that faith and confidence that we do know how to do this. I remember we just did a 5-month grief ritual training with about 800 people. And one of the questions, well, do we all have to be therapists to do this? And I don't know if I can swear on your program or not, but
You can go ahead.
I said, if we are waiting for that, we're fucked. This isn't a clinical problem. It becomes clinical when what it needs is denied. When grief isn't held in a communal way, it does tend to mutate, and it can become problematic because what the soul needs isn't being offered. So that the idea is that if we give it what it needs, the movement can happen. Grief, going back to that first question about taking it on, grief is never meant to be held continuously. It's meant to move. It's meant to cycle. That's why you look at, again, I'm not idealizing, but you look at traditional cultures. Like at my friend's village in West Africa, there was a grief ritual happening almost every day, someplace in the village. Sometimes small, sometimes massive. If it's a funeral, everybody's there. And for 3 days, they work together to acknowledge and work with the grief, but it's always moving. Here it becomes kind of a static thing. It's like they begin to haul it around, in backpacks and in trunks and in U-Hauls, but it's meant to keep moving. So if we are with a friend who's in grief and we feel it and we pick it up, take it into ritual, take it to a friend, take it to a tree, take it to a stone, take it to the water. Just keep it moving. We need agile, flexible human beings right now.
And I would just say, because my husband died during COVID. He didn't die of COVID, but he died during that time. And so you couldn't get together with people. You couldn't have a memorial service. But I discovered that by just going into the grief, by letting myself get tugged down into it, as horrible as it would always, always reach a point where it was like landing on a mattress. And then it was like sort of getting pushed back up again. So my sense was that the grief didn't want me to die. It didn't want to swallow me up. It just wanted me to kind of like say, okay, I'm with you. And then poof, you're done. You're not done permanently. It might happen in 2 hours or a week or whatever. But that was pretty amazing.
Well, we begin to understand grief's eternal entanglement with love. I mean, why do we grieve? Because what we love has been harmed or lost or disappeared, or I can't touch it anymore. We grieve because of the heart. So, everything you're saying right now is so correct around being willing to trust its intention, which is to open the heart even more. Was it Joanna Macy? It's the broken heart that's capable of holding the whole universe. It's something about allowing our hearts to be broken. allowing our hearts to really feel the fullness of this lifetime. And if you're going to love, you're going to lose, right? There's no two ways around that. Everything, that first gate is fierce, and you cannot negotiate that one.
I really love how you remind us that it's a wave, because when the wave abates and you've less feelings of grief, there is a natural sort of reluctance to step into a grief tending process, because you think, well, I'm all right today. I don't need to feel that. In fact, I'm scared of feeling that. And so I wonder whether you can talk to how people navigate those kind of ebbs and flows, and how culturally, we can't book these times, how maybe on a personal practice that there may be something that can be offered. So when you're in your space privately, these waves appear, and there's no community there necessarily to hold you. What would you suggest?
That's a very important question. Part of the apprenticeship with sorrow is about silence and solitude. So no matter how much I talk about community, the fact of the matter is, much of the time we're with our grief, we're alone, or outside of human community, I should say, because community is always available. Like we were saying about taking our grief out to the creek and wailing with the fish and the turtles and the ferns and everything that's there will witness your grief as well. So the main thing is we want to keep it relational, keep it circulating through relationships of magnitude, people who care about us. Sometimes people will leave their rituals, and we encourage them to form little dyads or triads of people that you can always be in touch with whenever you're touched by grief. So it doesn't take you right back into being isolated and alone again. That that there's somebody who understands and can hear me without trying to fix me. And sometimes they do writing practice together. We teach a writing practice there. They'll just write for 10 minutes, read to each other, say thank you, and hang up. But just having a place to have that touchstone where I know I will be held here, I will be received, my grief will matter to them, and they're going to be capable of being with me without trying to change me. Yeah.
We have to stop pretty soon, but I do want to ask you, because you had mentioned that so many more people have expressed their grief for the earth now than happened when you first started to do this. And I know you did a ceremony for the whales, for some whales.
Yes.
And I wondered if you would talk about that a little bit. And also if you've done any other kind of public ceremonies specifically for the earth.
The whale ritual was so poignant and so beautiful. A humpback whale washed up on shore just off of the coast here in Sonoma County, California. And we knew we needed to do something. We needed to gather and honor this death, because we know that the cause of most of these deaths is human factors. And so and there was about, 100 to 200 people gathered on the coast, and we gathered in circle, we sang, we created a cairn. People could bring, cairns are those piles of stones that mark a particularly important place. And so we built this cairn. We knew it also probably be washed away, but it was one of those places where we could all make our prayers and our apologies. And then we all walked down to the ocean and put a flower in the ocean. And it was just simple, but beautiful, and a place for us to collectively say goodbye, and we are sorry, and we're praying for your people. Most of my other rituals haven't been singularly focused. The last one I did in Salt Lake City in March was on earth grief. But most of the time, the rituals that we've done are for people who are working with earth grief. So a lot of work with environmentalists and people who are on the front lines of trying to change our relationship to the planet. And so they're carrying so much grief and rarely have any place to take it. I remember after one of these rituals, a woman spoke up and said, I was down there at the grief shrine and I was crying and crying, but I don't think I got it all out. What should I do? And I said, well, can you first pause and appreciate what you did do? That you showed up today, that you cared enough for the earth to come and weep for her. We're always looking at what we failed to do. This is that psychological framework of, well, I didn't do enough. But what about just appreciating the fact that you care, that this matters to you, that you're willing to grieve for her? And so I think most of the grief that I've been doing with activists has been really about trying to keep them from shutting down. Burning out is the language, right? So grief is a water ritual. It helps to cool some of that intense fire from fighting and being on the front lines and trying to change a system that is just so recalcitrant and so embedded in the economics of the times. But
yeah, and scientists are just expected to not show their emotions.
correct.
You work for 20 years to save a particular beetle or a particular canyon, and it fails to go through, and you're supposed to just move on to the next thing and be professional, quote,
Right.
professional.
Yeah.
I'd say the archaeological sector is exactly the same. And I've had colleagues who have worked in really very difficult, forensic archaeological work in, mass graves, and so that there's evidence gathering for, war crimes tribunals and things like that. So I think archaeology is also at that point where there needs to be a grief tending, because of that. The reductionist, concepts are, well, you just go on to the next job. It shouldn't affect your soul.
Right. Yeah, we've had many fires here in the last 5 years, 8 years, and working with the fire people, out there on the front lines, sometimes coming across bodies, and certainly many animals who have died, and the grief that they carry as first responders. There's very few sectors we could look around the country and say they don't carry grief. That's not the reality these days.
Well, before we stop, I would like to invite Francis and Harry to talk about the new book that is coming out, that they have both contributed chapters in, as well as many other luminaries. You want to tell us about your book?
Francis,
you start
you
here.
go ahead.
Well, I got invited by Stephanie Benarik a couple of years ago to join her and Viola Kamalafi and a couple other therapists to talk about psychology in the time of dying. And so we had this very engaged and alive conversation about what does it mean to do therapy? What is the relevance of psychology and psychotherapy in this particular time, what I'm calling the long dark? And it was a very rich conversation, and we didn't know at that point, but that conversation would then turn into invitational space for a lot of people to contribute essays and articles on how they are applying their work to this time. And the outcome has been this beautiful collaborative collection of essays and conversations and practices that I think are necessary, particularly for the psychological field, to get their arms around, their hearts around.
And what's the name of the book?
It's Climate, Psychology and Change. And the launch is going to be through the Pocket Project on the 18th of June, which I can put the link in if anybody wants to sign up, that you're most welcome. It has a tagline which I can't remember. But my contribution was talking about the Earth exchange process and also attending to place. And so as a sort of applied suggestive chapter where we take the psychological theory, the experiences in the back out into the field and actually utilizing connection to place as the arena in which we practice the ritual in those places. And yes, it feels very timely, and it feels quite edgy, and a necessary book. I would like to think that there's some very important new thinking coming out of the book.
Yeah.
And next, for our next Earth Exchange Cafe, our guest will be Steffi Bednarik, who is the editor of this collection of essays, and that'll be on July 10th at the same time. So, Francis, this has been a real pleasure. We could go on and talk for another couple of hours, and it would be fascinating, but thank you so much for being with us today.
So good to be with you too, and I hope we just added a little bit of nutrient to the collective imagination. So pleasure to be with you both.
I'm sure we have.
Yes, thank you so much. So it's my absolute joy to close the cafe doors. But before that, we just take one last look around us and notice that this conversation has enriched and has brought wonder and healing in just a short hour to lots of people who have watched and listened online, and for those in the future who are going to hear it as well. So a million thank yous, Francis, for your wisdom and your insights. And as we turn off the lights and shut the door, we await once more for the next conversation with Steffi. So thank you again, everybody, for your beautiful questions for Francis, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.